Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out. My name is ZRINKA STAHULJAK. I am professor of comparative literature and French here at UCLA and also director of the CMRS Center for Early Global Studies. This is going to be better, isn't it? And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this continuing series of new book salons that we started actually at the start of the pandemic, because it was one way to have an intimate setting and to keep up with our faculty, UCLA faculty, and also the associate faculty of our center, and to keep up with what they were doing in their most recent publications. And I'm very happy that Beth Morrison, who is the associate member of the center and has been an associate member of the center for a long time, is able to be here virtually, alas, today. And of course, this is a reminder for us of what we are still living with, and what we will probably still live with for another year. And unfortunately, we are hoping to have this year in person, but we will see, right, Beth? So I just want to say a few words about the center. And in fact, the new book salons were one way of keeping up with what we were doing, but another way is also to tell you a little bit about what we did during the pandemic. And basically the last 2.5 years, which have been a great time of transformation here at UCLA in many ways and at many levels. One of the ways we have seen the changes is the change in the center's name. We were known for 58 years of our history as the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, CMRS, and we are since September 2019 Center for Early Global Studies, or CEGS, and we kept CMRS in honor of that, so we are CMRS-CEGS as our abbreviation. So if you are interested in finding a little more about what we've been doing, we have been kind of embracing this early global approach to studying the world. You can look at our past programming and our future programming on our website, and also look at the research platform that actually undersigns in a sense the name change. It wasn't just a nominal change, it really is a conceptual and a methodological change, what we're trying to do as this early global. And I think one of the interesting things that are happening right now is that UCLA is in a new phase. As I was saying, it's part of these great transformations, is that we will have a new Dean of Humanities coming in, Alex Stern. Our Dean, David Skaberg, who has been Dean for 11 years, is stepping down in just actually 2 weeks. So that's one thing. And another thing, very important thing, is that UCLA's helm, Professor of Sociology, Darnell Hunt, former Dean of Social Sciences, has stepped into the role of the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, and he has made a commitment to community engaged learning and inclusive excellence. And in many ways, I think we at the center, as a Center for Early Global Studies today, are thinking about these issues. We're thinking about inclusivity. We're thinking about how to precisely study the world in all of its expansiveness under in the time periods that are under the purview of the center. And one of the main points that I would highlight today in connection to the new book salon and to the book that Boyd Morrison and Beth Morrison have written together, this book of historical fiction, is that I think what I believe the center can do is this global past for the 21st century, and is really thinking about how the past can participate in the not just the present, but in the discourses of the future. And for that, we need imagination. And so I think historical fiction perhaps might be a paradoxical way to say, well, thinking about history in a fictional setting is actually stimulating imagination and is stimulating the ways we can imagine the future. But I do truly believe that that is the case. So as a reminder, though, of the pandemic, as I said, Beth Morrison is with us virtually. I'm afraid she tested for COVID yesterday, but I'm glad that she is able to join us anyway on Zoom. And Boyd Morrison, who came down to be in person, who was originally going to be on Zoom. We have a slight reversal. So a few words of introduction of our speakers. Elizabeth Morrison, who is Senior Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, where she has been for 25 years now, and in those 25 years has curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions, including some of the most successful ones for the Getty, Imagining the Past in France, 1250 to 1500 in 2010, and Book of Beasts, the bestiary in the medieval world in 2019. And both catalogs for those shows were finalists for the College Arts Association Award for Outstanding Exhibition Catalog. Now she has published extensively on Flemish and French illumination. She has served on the boards of International Center of Medieval Art and the Medieval Academy of America. So she is more than qualified to have written a historical novel on the Middle Ages. And she has been, as I said, very closely involved with the center for a number of years. And I'm very honored to have actually worked with her on 2 publications for the Getty. And Boyd Morrison is a Seattle-based engineer, actor, Jeopardy champion, and the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 13 thrillers, including 6 collaborations with Clive Cussler in the Oregon Files series. So he is more than qualified to have written a novel as well. His first novel in the Tyler Locke series, The Ark, was an Indie Next Notable Pick and has been translated into more than 20 languages. He has a PhD in industrial engineering from Virginia Tech, earned 16 patents while working for RCA, flew on the Vomit Comet during his stint at NASA, and managed an Xbox games group at Microsoft. So please join me in welcoming Boyd and Beth Morrison, who will tell us about their book, The Lawless Land.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. This is the first time I'm seeing Beth since I arrived in LA, because she just got in from the UK and tested positive as soon as she landed. And so I came down to hang out with Beth, especially because we're just wrapping up our next book. And so, you know, it's nice to see you, Beth. And there you go. That is why she is not here.
Too. I'm sorry that I'm not feeling well, and I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but I wanted to start by thanking ZRINKA and the center for having us and for arranging this wonderful engagement this afternoon. I also wanted to thank the other staff at the center, including Brett and Aaron, who have really set up this event and helped us all along the way. And I also wanted to thank my brother Boyd for flying down here, and for the center for paying Boyd to fly down here to not see me.
Well, at least one of us can be here, so that's good. We just thought it would be the other way around.
Exactly.
So we're here to talk about our book, The Lawless Land, which is a historical adventure that takes place in the 14th century, specifically the year 1351, right after the worst of the Black Death during the 100 Years' War. So, you know, during post-pandemic and during a European war, so no relevance at all to present day. Still recovering from the pandemic, of course, and they were at the time of our book too. And if you read it, you'll see that the plague wasn't really over completely at that time. So, Beth, should we start off with just giving a little summary of the book?
Yeah, you usually do that better, and I'd also like to save my voice for talking about the medieval stuff.
Okay. So the story is about a knight errant who's lost his land and his title, and he is riding through the lonely woods of southwestern or southeastern England, and comes across a noblewoman who is running from a gang of brutal soldiers who are trying to kill her, and he comes to her rescue and finds out that she is in possession of an object that is priceless and is wanted by some of the most powerful men in Europe. And so he goes on a quest with her to try to bring this object to safety while they're trying to escape across Europe during wartime. And so what we wanted to do with the story is harken back to adventures of days past, like Three Musketeers, Robin Hood, high adventure, like King Arthur, and even The Princess Bride has a lot of, because we have horse chases and duels and secret tunnels and all kinds of twists and turns. And so it's much more of a thriller, I would say, even than a historical fiction. And so I had written 12 contemporary thrillers before this, and I was just wrapping up my last book with Clive Cussler, and I knew I had decided I wanted to move on to writing my own books again. And I was talking to my wife about what I was going to do next, and I said, and she said, I said, I think maybe historical fiction might be something I could do, but the only period of history that I knew really well was World War II, and the market was flooded with World War II books at the time. And my wife said, well, if you want to write a historical thriller, you have a built-in co-author. And I said, well, who's that? And she said, your sister, who is a world authority on the Middle Ages. And I said, oh, yes, of course, because Beth has edited all of my books. Before that, she's a big thriller fan, and she has helped me with every single one of my books. So I called her up. And what was that phone call like, Beth?
It started out with, do you want to write a book? And about 30 milliseconds later, I said, yes, I would like to write a book. And one of the things that was really interesting about the process is, I think when a lot of us think about historical fiction, we think about a novel that goes really deeply into one historical event, or is a very detailed analysis of a particular medieval period. And what Boyd and I really wanted to do, as he said, was to introduce much more like a modern thriller feeling into the book, rather than what we think of as historical fiction. And that process in itself felt very medieval, because of course the romance itself, as many of you know, was a genre that was developed during the Middle Ages. And as ZRINKA mentioned, she and I have actually worked on 2 Getty manuscripts together in publications, the Roman de Julien de Trazegnies and the Livre des Faits de Jacques de Lalande. And both of those, one is fiction, one is more biography, but both of them have elements of an adventurous life, essentially, following a character through all these ups and downs until they finally get sort of a happy ending. I mean, Jacques de Lalande actually died at the end of his, so that wasn't as happy. But Julien de Trazegnies, was a much more a fictional sort of romance that went along. And so it felt really like Boyd and I were trying to bring the medieval romance genre into the present. And I think that's what you'll find a lot in the book. Just like the romance genre, my dissertation was on the roman antique, specifically about the Roman de Troyes. And it has all the same elements that the Lawless Land does in terms of sort of unlikely adventures and different things that the hero has to confront in terms of moral dilemmas and bad guys. All of that is built right into the book. And I'm sorry that I'm so hoarse. One of the other things that's funny about this is that, as Boyd said, our book is set in 1351, which is just a couple of years after the worst depredations of the Black Plague. And here we are about 2 years after the introduction of COVID-19, and it obviously still has an impact very much on our society. And even though Boyd and I had written most of the book, in fact, before the COVID-19 pandemic came along, it really did inform the way that we finished up the book in terms of really understanding how the characters might have reacted to the impact of something like the plague. Boyd, maybe you could say something more about that.
Yeah, I think being able to understand what those people must have been going through as they were coming out of it. And of course, it was an even worse plague than the one we've had, where people could have lost half the people they'd ever known within a few weeks because the plague, or as I learned, and you know, part of the fun for me doing this book was I would never have tried this without Beth, because I have even though Beth has done her best to teach me all of the stuff about the Middle Ages, I really would never have done this without her, because there was so much to learn. And so, for example, I didn't know that at the time of the Black Plague, it was not called the Black Plague. It was called, or the Black Death. It was called the pestilence or the Great Mortality. And so I had to retrain myself for that. And so it was very enlightening to be going through that as we were writing the book. As Beth said, we started planning the book a year before COVID-19 hit. And so it was just pure coincidence that it happened. And luckily we were able to go and do our research trip, because this is an epic journey across England, France, and Italy. And so we wanted to actually feature places that still exist today, but are very similar to what you would have seen at the time of our book, which is pretty astounding that it's 670 years later and we can go and see what our characters would have seen at that time period. And very little has changed since then. And so, for example, we went to Notre Dame, which is featured in the book, 2 months before the tragic fire that almost destroyed it. And so we were very lucky that we were able to see it before that happened, because of course it's been closed since then and probably won't open again until I think 2024. And so what's really neat for me, thinking back on the book now, and is that almost every place in the book you can go and see and still exists. And so we featured Canterbury Cathedral and Mont Saint-Michel and Notre Dame and the Avignon Papal Palace. And really, Beth and I chose the locations for our book based on where we wanted to go visit. So, you know, it was a good excuse to, and hopefully this series will continue for a long time. So we can continue to take trips to Europe and use that as an excuse to write a book. And so when we were thinking of the plot, we were thinking about what did we want to write about? We knew we wanted it to be an exciting story. And one thing we talked about was the trope of the knight errant, which is very popular in fiction even today. So for example, there's an author named Lee Child who writes the Jack Reacher series. And he was kind enough to give us a blurb for the book, which was really cool. He said that Gerard Fox, our main character, could be Jack Reacher 700 years ago, which is very cool. But he has often said that Jack Reacher is a modern day version of a knight errant. He goes around to towns all across America and takes on the bad guys, and then he leaves. And you can see that in many different kinds of storylines, like The Mandalorian is basically a knight errant. The spaghetti westerns with Clint Eastwood, where you would go around to towns and clean up the town and then leave, that's a knight errant. And so when we were thinking about the plot, we were thinking, well, why not actually go back to the Middle Ages and do an actual knight errant story? Because we hadn't really seen that in the market right now. And so we just wanted to go back to the origins of this and write about a knight errant. But of course, we wanted to pair him up with a very clever and powerful woman who was going to be as strong as he was. And of course, in this time period, that was not very common. And so when we were talking about our characters, what did you think we were trying to do with that, Beth?
Well, of course, to me, one of the main characters in the book is the priceless object that Boyd was mentioning. And when
I think we can give away that
it
was a manuscript.
Yes, I told him the main thing is that the object has to be a manuscript. A manuscript has to play a prime role in the actual novel. And so I would say there's actually three main characters. There's the male main character, the female main character, and the manuscript. And Boyd and I have actually just finished the second novel in the series. Boyd sent it off today, in fact. And it also features fabulous artworks from the Middle Ages. So that I think will be something that will continue to be key in the series. But one of the reasons we chose to do 1351 specifically was because I'm actually working on a scholarly book. For those of you who know the Survey of French Manuscripts, which is an ongoing series where scholars choose 100 or more individual manuscripts to stand in for a particular time period. My colleague, Andy Hedeman, who's at the University of Kansas, she and I were asked to do the 14th century volume for the Survey of French Manuscripts. And so obviously I know a lot about the 14th century, and I knew that I was really going to be delving into the material culture of the 14th century, including illuminations, which could really be a source of inspiration for Boyd and I as we set the novel. So when we chose the 14th century, then it seemed, well, let's choose something right after the plague, because that was such a period of upheaval and societal change. And so we thought it would be a good time to set a novel because so much was happening, of course, not knowing that we would be going through the same things in our actual physical lives. And one of the aspects that I thought was really interesting when we did the lockdown and we were looking at what was happening, it really, I think all of you probably felt the same, that it hadn't changed much since the time of the Black Death. There was nothing we could do. All we could do was isolate at home and watch the news of the plague coming closer and closer and closer to our homes. It's 700 years later, and we think of having all of these additional resources and medical knowledge. Of course, we know now how pathogens are traced, how they're passed between people. It didn't actually make a difference in terms of what we could do as individuals in facing the situation. And so I think that was really helpful to Boyd and I when we were trying to sketch the characters about the state that they were in mentally coming out of this time of plague. And it's one of the things I think that infuses particularly the female character, because it was a time of renewal. It was a time of people being very thankful that they hadn't lost their times in the plague, and a time of thinking about how things could be different. One of the things that I tried to help Boyd with, and that I had to do a lot of reading myself, was actually understanding what it was like societally coming out of the Black Death, and about the changes, the very, very huge changes socioeconomically that took place in the years following the Black Death. And so we've really tried to incorporate that as much as possible into the novel. And when we were doing our travels, it was very hard for me because I'm used to going to Europe and studying basically anything medieval or anything even art related that I want. And yet I was kind of having to train my mind. I can only look at things that were here in 1351 or before. And it was like a horse with blinders. I'm not allowed to look at anything else. And that was a very, very new way of traveling through Europe for me. And Boyd and I have actually traveled a lot together when we were young and also adults. How would you characterize the difference in our travel journeys when we're trying to do these book trips?
Well, it's very focused because before we go, we know essentially what the plot that we want is. And so we're going to try to inform the plot, learn details so that we can make the descriptions richer. It also gives us ideas for scenes. So we'll look at something and go, oh, Gerard Fox could be hanging off that and having a sword fight. And so it really almost every single location we went to gave us ideas about what we could do in the story. So it was very useful, I felt, but when we were there, we were very focused on, okay, we need to go here and look at this. And it was funny because we would have tour guides who would want to tell us everything about the history of this place. And we said, no, if it's after 1351, we don't want to hear it because it's not useful. So they want to tell us about the Renaissance and all these new pieces of art. And this has no bearing on our book. And we have a very limited time period to do this. And so it was very direct. And so I think the tour guides were always, what kind of tourists are these that they only want to look at stuff that's 1351 and before? So that was probably very unusual for them. And it was also, we were go. I mean, I think we were there 10 days and we basically followed the journey that Gerard Fox and Isabel, the name of the noblewoman in the story, follow in the book, because we wanted to see, and of course we did it in 10 days and it takes them about 2 months. And of course they get into all kinds of adventures and ordeals along the way. I don't think we had too many of those while we were traveling. So it was good for us to see where and we pretty much went in the same order too that they went. And so I think it was very different than our normal trip where we just are, yeah, we don't know what we're doing today. Let's go just hang out and see what we see. But this time we were, okay, we need to be here at 9, and then, okay, by 11, we need to be at this location so we can see this. And, but still, I mean, we get to see all kinds of fascinating architecture and art and places that fed into the story. So for example, I don't think you had been to Mont Saint-Michel either, had you, Beth?
I had.
You had, but I had never been there, and it's pretty magical place. And I probably most people here know what it is, but it's an island right off the coast of France that for part of the time when the tide is out, it is connected to the mainland. You can actually walk across the sandy tidal flats. But when the tide comes in, it's an island. And it can come in very rapidly. And the sand is always wet, so there's actually quicksand around the island. And they actually can teach you how to get yourself unstuck from the quicksand. And so, of course, as soon as I saw that, well, that's going to figure into the story somehow. So it's that kind of thing that really helped us make a more exciting story. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, Beth, was how we built the characters and the dialogue, because we were writing a story that we wanted to appeal to people who are reading it now. And so, of course, we weren't going to write the dialogue in Middle English because we didn't want it to feel like you're reading Chaucer in its original form. So we had to make the dialogue accessible. And so the way we looked at it is we have many characters speaking French, and other languages as well. And so when we were writing the dialogue, we really essentially looked at it as we were translating the Middle English just like we were translating the Middle French. And that's not to say that we made it totally contemporary either. So we certainly had to keep an eye out for words that didn't make sense at the time period. Also, the New World had not been discovered at this point, so we couldn't have people eating tomatoes and avocados and potatoes, and there were things that I didn't know. For example, we've just fixed this in for future editions, but I wrote something to the effect of this character leaped to his feet and feeling as light as a hummingbird. And I did not realize that hummingbirds are only native to North and South America. They did not exist in Europe at the time of our book. And so it just didn't occur to me. And our British reader wrote that and said, we don't have hummingbirds here in England. And so they wouldn't have known what a hummingbird was at the time of our book. So I had to change that metaphor to a sparrow. But it's that, and I think I also, didn't I, Beth, write that a character was in his armor and felt like he was baking like a potato, and you wrote, they don't know what a potato is. So I think I changed it to baking like a bread or something.
Yeah.
But Beth, I think that also translated to the type of characters that we wanted to create, especially for Gerard Fox and Isabel. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's interesting about our characters is that, you know, we really did try hard to make the book as medieval as we could. And in fact, you know, when Boyd asked me to do this, I was like, well, heck, I know a lot about the Middle Ages. I certainly can do this. And I realized very quickly that I know a lot about medieval illumination, but that does not mean that I know a lot about the Middle Ages. So in the first days when Boyd was writing, he was like, okay, so what would they have painted a toll bridge in 1351 in Cambridge? And would he be riding a courser or a destrier, or what kind of horse? And I quickly realized that I really did not know much about daily life in the Middle Ages. But the nice thing about being a trained medievalist is that I know how to find out. And so a lot of the details that you'll see in the book really were things that I researched for a really long time. And then sometimes we couldn't find the answer, so we just made it up. But so what you'll find in the book is that the details are as medieval as we can make them, but the characters have much more of a modern mindset, as Boyd mentioned. And I think that that is, you know, we're not, as we said, we're not trying to write a medieval book. We're trying to write an entertaining book that modern audiences will find appealing. And that means making characters who have aspects of them which seem ahead of their time. So for instance, I think Boyd and I actually brought a little of our individual personalities to the characters, in that Gerard Fox is very into ingenuity, into the sort of next technological thing. And so he's constantly reading to try to find out what's next and keep ahead of sort of his time period in terms of inventions. And meanwhile, everyone, the Isabel character, is very forward thinking. You'll find that she is very interested in history, and she wants to herself write history books, which of course is what I do for a living. So I think each of the characters has a little bit of us in them, but they also have a mindset. And it was kind of fun to write because they have mindsets that are very much more modern than what medieval characters would have been with. And they sort of tussle with that a little bit. They sort of go back and forth a little bit, both against the other characters in the book, against the society around them, and also with each other in terms of expectations of what a woman would do in the time period and what a man would do in the time period. And I think that adds some real interest to the book.
Especially when the villains still have the more medieval mindset and constantly underestimate what Isabel is doing, because she contributes very much, as much, if not more, to the story as Gerard Fox, because we really wanted to make them a partnership in this story. It's not just Gerard Fox constantly saving her. In fact, I think she saves him even more than he saves her. But it's really, they're together. And I think part of what we wanted to emphasize is they just happen to find the exact right person for each other. That any other woman for Gerard Fox would not measure up, in the same for Isabel, because they have that more progressive mindset compared to everybody else in this time period. And I think that's, you know, sometimes what it takes for culture to move forward is have those people who have that new kind of mindset. And so if they just happen to find the exact right person for them in a very unusual way. And but there are other aspects of the story we tried to get it as accurate to the time period as possible, with keeping in mind that this is an action-packed thriller that we want to have people racing forward through the story and not put down. And so there are, I think, maybe 2 or 3 times that we decided that in favor of story, we would just massage history a little bit. So for example, there is a tournament in the story, and we changed the normal, and that's the other thing. This isn't necessarily that it couldn't have happened in the time period, but traditionally in a tournament, you have the melee portion of the tournament and happening last, because that's the highlight of the tournament, and the jousts that we typically normally think of as a tournament comes first. But for the storyline that we wanted to create, the joust worked better coming second. Now, we don't have records of every single tournament that took place in the Middle Ages, so it could be possible that they changed the order of them in some cases. So it's not something that's out of the realm of possibility. It's just less likely. And so, but most of the time, Beth would say to me, "We can't do that. Nobody would do that in that time period." I'd say, "Okay, tell me a way that we can make the story work your way." And so there was a lot of back and forth. We plan the book a lot when we're each walking our dogs, and so we'll be on the phone going, "Okay, what can Gerard Fox be doing in this chapter? How does he get from here to here? How does he figure this thing out? What's the villain doing?" You know, so we basically plotted out the book walking our dogs.
And I think the other question we get, well, one of the questions we get a lot is like, how much did we fight during the course of writing this book? And I would say
why we can't be in the same room right now.
That's exactly right. I think that, you know, I was much more active on sort of the front end in her helping to do the plot. And I tried to introduce things that would be interesting, that were only things that would really make a difference in the Middle Ages. So not to give away too much of the book, but the main character, Gerard Fox, you find out in the early portion of the book, is excommunicated. And so we really delved into that. We leaned into that. What would that really mean in the Middle Ages? Things that people didn't know. And then for an example of the kinds of things where I told, you know, Boyd, we were talking about the opening of the book takes place at the translation feast for Thomas of Canterbury. And of course, Boyd had never heard the word translation before. He didn't know what that meant. And most of our readers wouldn't. So we had sort of a couple of paragraphs about what translation of a saint's relics means and who Thomas of Canterbury was and what happened. And it just sounded like a history lesson in the middle of this action-packed story. So part of our challenge was to try to make it an actual part of the story, which we did by having Fox and Isabel have read different accounts of the martyrdom of St. Thomas Becket, and they start debating which of the accounts is probably closer to the truth, so that we could include them in this story of trying to get the information out. So those kinds of things were really fun.
And it was really cool for me to think about in this time period, even for them, these things that they're talking about or seeing happened 100 years or more in their past. So when did Thomas Becket, when was he murdered? In the 1100s?
Yeah.
So this is 200 years before their time that they're talking about something. So it would be like us talking about the American Revolution. And, you know, at the time when they visit Notre Dame, it was already 100 years old. And of course, still being worked on just like it is today. And so that's the amazing thing to me to think about, even in this time period, things that I think Mont Saint-Michel was started construction in the year 800 in the 9th century, maybe, somewhere around that time period. And so it was already a very old place for them to be going to visit. So that's a really astounding thing for me to think about, especially living in a country where nothing is that old. And so it was fun for me to go and see that and think about the characters of our book being in the same place so long ago. But yeah, Beth and I get along really well. We, as we said, we've been on many trips together outside of the research trips we've taken for the book. And so, and again, she's edited all of my books. So this was kind of a no-brainer to do together. And we hope we're going to do many more books in the series. So for example, as Beth said, we just turned in the second book today to our publisher. And we announced the title. It's called The Last True Templar. And so you can imagine what the book might be about. And for that book, where do we go to visit, Beth?
We had a fabulous trip to Italy back in October. And in fact, it was a great time to travel. It was between two surges of COVID. On that trip, neither of us managed to get sick. And there was no one there. In fact, when we got to Venice, I told Boyd, I'm never going to want to come back to Venice again because this is too fabulous. It was really, really fun. And I think one of the things that is great about the book is that Boyd and I really do have a good time talking all this kind of stuff together. We have a good time traveling. We have a good time coming up with these plot points. And I think it really comes through in the writing, in the book itself, that you can kind of pick up on that kind of love for the Middle Ages that I have, the good times that Boyd has thinking through adventures. And so I think that's a really important element, hopefully that will make the novel successful. But I see that we're going a little bit, I mean, I think we've talked enough. I think we should maybe take questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for making it so alive, but also making us understand that the past is still very much with us, and that really came through in what the way you were talking about about Notre Dame and about the pandemic, of course, and about the kinds of upheavals that they went through, that we're going through. And it's not just about the perils. I mean, I was very struck about how you said, well, it made us think differently about the characters. What we are going through now made us think differently and made about the characters and made us understand the characters better. And possibly, I don't know, maybe that's just a question mark for me or a question to you, possibly made you also from that perspective of imagining the Middle Ages think maybe differently or understand something about what's going on with us when you said, oh, well, we still don't have answers, just like they didn't have answers, right? So kind of undoing that certainty that we are more scientific and more, progressive dealing with pandemics than they were. So thank you very much for that. I will open it up to the floor. Both floors, actually, we have a number of people on Zoom. So please, for those on Zoom, lift your hand. Is that how we say it? I forgot. So
raise your hand.
Raise your hand on Zoom or put your question in the chat. And same thing here. Don't put it in the chat here, but raise your hand if you have a question. And while we're thinking about questions, I do have one question. I was, Beth, you had mentioned to me and I had seen it in the materials around the book that the main character's name is Gerald Fox. But when you were talking about the book, the two of you, I thought, Fox? Why not Wolf? Or why not, Leo something? So that's my first question. Why Gerald Fox?
Well, it's Gerard. And
Gerard.
he the reason we chose it is because of something Beth mentioned earlier, which is that he is very clever and very into he's not somebody who's using brute force to solve all of his problems, although he is a good fighter and a good swordsman. He solves a lot of his problems using clever tactics or tricks or ruses. And so that's much more like a fox than a noble lion or a brutish wolf. And in fact, we partly we built his character on the legend of Renard, who is a medieval trickster that was very popular stories at the time of our book. And it's even remarked on in the novel that he is much like Renard, and Renard is now it wasn't at the time the French word for fox, but it became synonymous with a fox. And so it changed. What was the word for fox at the Vulpine or something?
Goupil.
Yeah. And it changed to Renard because he was such a popular figure. And so we wanted to emphasize that he's, and in the Renard stories, the major villain is actually the wolf, Isengard. Not Isengard, Isengrim. Isengrim. And so the villain in the story is much more like Isengrim, the wolf. And so, yeah, so, and part of the Renard stories is he constantly gets the better of Isengrim by using his clever tricks. And that's exactly what Gerard Fox does.
And ZRINKA, one thing you will be interested in is the reason so that, of course, I had to include the bestiary in the story. The medieval bestiary is one of my prime areas of research. And so the fox came up. But Gerard, as you know, is one of the twin sons' names of Julien de Trésigny. And so that was where his first name came from. So both aspects of the name came from my medieval studies.
So if I get this correctly, we can use your book to teach our undergraduate classes, but only ever so occasionally we will have to say, no, this is not how it was.
Yeah, I
But,
think you
but
need
that
to
other
buy
thing, yes, that's how
copies
it
for
was.
every intro class at UCLA. I think it's very important.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. So we have a couple of questions on chat that I will read out. And if I've missed your hand coming up here in the audience, please wave, start waving or get up or something, start jumping. But so here are the first question online from Fiona McMillan. What were some favorite sources for learning about daily life during that time period?
You want to talk about that, Beth?
Yeah, so the one part I was mentioning Boyd and I working process, I was sort of important at the front end and at the back end of editing, but Boyd is actually the professional writer. So he actually writes out the chapters and then he says things like, they go into a drugstore and then I add in what an actual apothecary shop would be like, or she was wearing a dress and then I add in what the dress would have actually looked like. And so a lot of my sources are primary sources, and I talk about this in the historical note at the end of the book, which I believe is there for sale, so you can see it for yourself. And we sort of talk about which things are actually factual and some of the background of the places and whatnot. But we do talk about the sources for where we came up with some of this. And so I would say medieval illuminations themselves were a really good source. For instance, we did this whole thing about whether women rode astride or a side saddle at the time period. And you can find a lot of illuminations where women are not riding side saddles. So we know, for instance, that they rode astride during the time period. But we also had some really fabulous books to help us with people who've actually written about daily life in the time period. And I'm trying to remember what A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, which is one of the books that sort of all of us as medievalists may at least know about, even if we have not read. But then there are people who have actually written about it more from the outside. And so there's something called the Time Traveler's Guide to Chaucer's England or something like that. Do you remember the title? I have the book right here.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England. So we use that. And actually Beth found some original sources too. So there is a duel in the story, and Beth actually found the original rules for setting a duel in medieval France. And so one of the interesting tidbits was, and we originally learned this from a book called The Last Duel by Eric Jaeger.
Who's here with us on Zoom.
Yeah. Oh, great. Hi. But he brought up the fascinating, in his fascinating true story, the incredible detail that during a judicial duel to the death, it wasn't like a tournament where people were cheering and rooting for their favorite. It was a very serious, somber affair. And by order of the king, on pain of death, they were not allowed to make any noise in the gallery watching the duel. And so a duel was conducted in complete silence from the audience because they were witnessing basically an execution. And so there was no reason to be cheering during the duel. And so there were a lot of rules, a lot of setup. And so thanks to Eric, Beth was able to go find the original rules that were set for these duels. And so it's just really cool to see those, put those kind of details in.
Yeah, I wanted to mention how thankful we were for Eric's support and help all along the way. He actually met with Boyd and I years and years ago and encouraged us to work on a historical project. So thanks to Eric. I wanted to mention the books that I was mentioning, I got them sort of combined. One was Daily Life in Chaucer's England by Geoffrey Forgang, who's actually a friend, and then The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer. And those were both really good sources. And
we include a bibliography at the end of the book as well.
Definitely can use in an undergraduate class. It has a bibliography, right? So another question from Linda Abrams. I understood you to say that you chose to imbue your characters with modern sensibilities. Wouldn't it be more interesting to work with their medieval sensibilities than the dissonance of portraying Nancy Drew in a Uppland?
I don't know that we based Isabel on Nancy Drew, but we did talk about that a lot. And what we decided is we wanted to have, because it's an adventure story and not, it's high adventure. So it's supposed to be entertaining, fun. And so for instance, we don't have any rape scenes, which is a very common occurrence at that time. And it kind of takes away from the fun if you're portraying that. But of course it was very common and a tragic aspect of that time period. So there were things that we wanted to have the reader be able to connect with it, with the story from a more modern viewpoint. So we made Gerard Fox have the typical view of a knight in that time period. It may not even be something that people could identify with because it's so different from how we think today that I think in some ways it would have been more distracting. And yes, it would have been more truthful to the time period, but that's not the type of book we were writing. And certainly there's a place for that kind of book. And you know, that's great, but that's not the kind of story we wanted to write.
And I think just to add on to that a little bit, you know, this is popular fiction. This is not, you know, we're not trying to write a history book. And I think that when you look at any kind of popular fiction, when you look at the main characters, none of them are an actual person that you would like run into on the street, especially in the thriller genre. You know, Boyd, as Rinka mentioned, worked on something with Clive Cussler called The Oregon Files. And his main character in those books is Juan Cabrillo. And Juan Cabrillo doesn't, I mean, he's a larger than life heroic character who really wouldn't exist in real life either. So I kind of thought of it as something to do with the genre that we're doing, that you always pick as your hero someone who is larger than life, who embodies idealistic concepts that don't necessarily actually exist in the real world. I don't know, Boyd, would you say that's a fair?
Yeah, and I think we wanted to write about somebody who's unusual, not typical for the time period. And because I think that helps us also show the difference between what's the characters who we are more typical of the time period were thinking at the time, and kind of juxtaposing that, because you know, the villains definitely had a much more medieval view of what women were allowed and should be doing at that time. And so having Gerard have a different sensibility just makes it clearer how different their viewpoint is from our viewpoint now.
Thank you. Yes, Marion in the room. Marion Horowitz, take the.
So this has been a delightful presentation, and I'm glad you mentioned The Distant Mirror. I think during Professor Bisson's medieval history course at Brown, it was on an extra list, and I just went for that. During a French Revolution class, I actually read War and Peace. I mean, I did things like that. But the Distant Mirror footnotes, lots of details, and it makes clear, that the characters, it says right at the beginning what the characters are fiction, but I assign sections for the Jacquerie. It's still really the best way to step into the revolt in both Paris and among the peasantry. So, there's just potential there. And I just wanted to tell you that the Dean of Engineering at SC took my husband and I, we stopped at Rhodes, and he's from Rhodes, and he took us on an afternoon tour, and we saw the Templar spot there. And I think you want to go to the Isle of Rhodes.
That's a great idea. We may be featuring that. Yeah, no, it's we've been to Rhodes, haven't we, Beth? It's a pretty amazing spot. But one other thing I wanted to mention about the medieval time period is people's views about animals is very different in the time period of our book than it is now. And Beth and I are both animal lovers. And so animals feature into the story, and we don't like cruelty to animals, but the way people naturally treated animals for that time would be very cruel to us now. And so again, we didn't want to distract, even if it would have been true to the time period, it would have been distracting from our fun adventure if we showed how people actually treated animals at the time. So we actually, Fox's horse, Zephyr, is a major character in the story as well.
Thank you. We have another question in the room.
Hi.
Kirsty Francis.
Thank you all so much for a really fascinating overview and talk. It sounds like a really fun book. It sounds like you guys kind of realized a lot of things that maybe shattered from preconceptions about the Middle Ages. And I guess I'm just thinking about, in light of the center's globality, was there anything that kind of surprised you as you were doing work or traveling in preparation for this series that like kind of open new light on how global the Middle Ages were, or kind of how people were crossing paths? I'm imagining, especially with like your work in Venice, that's totally different, or a really cosmopolitan city, right? So I'd just love to hear about how that intersects.
Yeah, Beth, do you want to talk about that?
One thing that you'll see in the book, we did talk about that quite a bit. And so one of the characters that you'll see in the book is a character that Boyd came up with, who I think plays a really interesting role. His name is Yusef, and he's actually a man from Egypt who is Gerard Fox's best friend. And we wanted to introduce him into the story because I think people do have a misconception about the Middle Ages in terms of how white it was. I don't think any of us want to deny the fact that it was not fun to be a person of color in the Middle Ages, but I think there's an equal balance between going too far the other way and saying that it was a sort of complete hegemony in terms of whiteness and religion. So I'll turn it over to Boyd in a second to talk about Yusef, but one of the other characters we have in this story is a Jewish doctor who lives in Avignon and plays a really important role in the book. And we did a lot of really good research in terms of the role of Jewish doctors in Avignon in the 14th century in particular. The Pope at that time period actually had a Jewish doctor himself. And so I think that those are really unusual and interesting things that people don't realize about the Middle Ages. So do you want to talk about Yusef a little bit, Boyd?
Yeah, well, Yusef is from Egypt, but he's a Coptic Christian, which would have been very different for many people, in addition to how he looked, because Christianity was Catholicism. They didn't even call it the Catholic Church; they just called it the Church. And so, having somebody else who was different was something to be noted. But one of the things that, again, that Gerard Fox and Isabel are different from many people in the time period is they just accept Yusef for who he is, and that is not an important distinction for them. And so they treat him just like they would treat anybody else. And so I think, what we wanted to show was that there were, I think probably there were people at the time period who did feel that way, that they're, people of different colors were not something to be feared. And of course, there were a lot of people who did fear it, just like there are today. So again, very relevant to you'd think 670 years later, we would be much more progressive, but there is still a lot of medieval thinking today, unfortunately.
Thank you. One more question on online. Lisa Price, Beth and Boyd, so happy there will be a second book because the first one is a great read. That's a great wrap-up question. A wrap-up comment. Did the two of you, when growing up, ever work on any kind of project together?
All right, so I'm going to start this one out. When I was, I think in 8th grade, was the 1984 Olympics. And for those of you who remember back that far, the Winter Olympics of 1984, there was a brother-sister figure skating team, pairs figure skaters, who won the silver medal. And I was convinced that Boyd and I were the next Olympian brother-sister team who were going to do something together. Of course, neither of us knew how to skate, so that was a slight impediment to fame and fortune based on the brother-sister pairing. But I always think it's very funny that all these years later, we actually are doing something together that is sort of putting us out there into the public realm as a work together.
Yeah, and it's been a great experience. And as we said, we've just wrapped up the book 2, and we're hoping there's going to be many more, because we just have a lot of fun with these stories, and we love traveling to do the research. And so we hope there's going to be many more.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that, Boyd and I have always really gotten along together. I don't think we've ever engaged in a big project like this together, but I think we've always been really supportive of each other's works and even our personal lives. Like, I ran one marathon in my life down in New Orleans back in 2003, and Boyd actually flew to New Orleans so that he could come around to different parts of the course and cheer me on. And I've always been a first reader for his books and given him commentary. So I think it does make a difference that we always were really great friends. And so it's actually kind of a dream project because we get to work together professionally for the first time.
Next step, executive producers on, multi-season series, right?
Yeah, we would love that. Well, I think I'm also an actor, so I would love to get a speaking. That would be my requirement, is I get a speaking role. I think Beth would not want to act in it. She's tried that before, and it's not her cup of tea. But I think coming on as a subject matter expert,
technical advisor.
Yeah,
she did act in Tipsy Medievalists.
That's true.
Right.
For those of you who don't know about Tipsy Medievalists, you can Google it and find out. So thank you both so very much. I'm sorry again, Beth, we're unable to be with us in person, but Boyd is here and the book is here. So 2 out of the 3 characters are here, right? Isabel is virtual, but Gerard and the book are here. And I invite anyone who's interested. The book is available to be purchased. For those of you online, well, of course, you can always click on that Amazon button, but I recommend bookshop.org, an independent website where you can get the books too. So please do so. And thank you everyone for having come and for having listened to our New Book Salon.
And thank you again to the
Thank you very
Center
much.
and to ZRINKA for having us.